Arrogant child insults and sticks tongue out at Black Royal Guard. What happened next shocked everyone. Tyler Morrison's pink tongue shot out of his mouth for the third time in 5 minutes, aimed directly at the impassive face of Sergeant David Washington. The 11-year-old boy swayed from one foot to the other in front of the Veterans Memorial, clearly bored by the solemn ceremony taking place around him. "Look, Dad," Tyler announced loudly, enough for dozens of people to hear. "This guy doesn't even blink. I bet he's not even a real soldier. He's probably just an actor hired to stand there like a statue." Richard Morrison, CEO of a billion-dollar technology company, was too busy answering emails on his cell phone to pay attention to his son. His wife, Patricia, made sure to film everything on Instagram stories, narrating to her followers how boring it was to have to attend a military ceremony just because her husband had made a hefty donation to a veterans foundation. Sergeant David Washington stood at attention, his eyes fixed on the horizon. At 28, he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. His medals for merit and courage in combat remained discreetly pinned to his immaculate uniform. At that moment, he was part of the honor guard paying tribute to fallen soldiers, in a ceremony that took place every first Sunday of the month. Tyler moved closer to the barrier, his $2,000 sneakers stepping on the perfectly manicured grass of the memorial. "Hey, soldier!" he shouted, causing several people to turn around with shocked expressions. "Can you talk, or do you just stand there like a broken robot?" The boy began making exaggerated faces, sticking out his tongue and rolling his eyes, while some tourists whispered indignant comments. An elderly woman shook her head in disapproval, while a veteran in a wheelchair clenched his fists in obvious annoyance. David kept his military discipline intact, but something in his eyes had changed. He recognized this type of provocation. During his years of service, he had faced situations much worse than a spoiled kid testing boundaries. But this time was different. He was on American soil, honoring his comrades who had not returned home, and being disrespected in front of families who had lost their sons, husbands, and fathers in combat. "Tyler, come here now," Patricia finally called to her son, but without any real authority in her voice. She was more concerned with getting the perfect angle for her social media than correcting his behavior. The boy completely ignored his mother. Instead, he decided to escalate his provocation to a level that no one there could have predicted. He looked David straight in the eye, stuck out his tongue one last time, and shouted, "Hey, chocolate soldier, I bet you can't even fight. You're probably just good for standing around and looking pretty for pictures." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the small children stopped playing. Patricia dropped her phone. Richard finally looked up from his screen, and the veteran in the wheelchair began to approach with an expression that mixed fury and disbelief. David Washington didn't move an inch. His years of military training had taught him absolute control. But for the first time in his career, he felt something different pulsing through his veins. It wasn't anger. It was something much more powerful and calculated. There, in front of all the shocked and disapproving stares directed at the boy, David maintained a serene expression that only someone with his military background and determination, forged on battlefields, could sustain. What no one at that memorial could have imagined was that this childish provocation had just awakened something in David that would turn that sunny Sunday into a milestone that would be remembered for much longer than a simple ceremony. If this story of prejudice and disrespect touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a moment of public humiliation would turn into a lesson that would not only change the life of a privileged family, but echo far beyond that memorial. The racist slur echoed through the memorial like a silent bomb exploding. Tyler Morrison was clearly proud of his joke, turning around to see if anyone else had found it funny. Instead, he found dozens of horrified faces staring at him, as if he were a creature from another planet. Patricia finally put away her phone, more concerned with her public image than her son's education. "Don't talk like that." "Talk like what, Mom?" Tyler retorted with all the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. I just told the truth. Look at his color, and I bet he can't even fight. These soldiers today are all wimps. Richard. Morrison finally looked up from his phone, but not to reprimand his son. Patricia, control the kid. People are looking. His concern was purely for appearances, not for the absurd racism he had just witnessed. David Washington remained motionless, but his eyes now followed the boy's every move. During his years in Afghanistan, he had learned to identify real threats from empty provocations. Tyler Morrison was clearly the latter, a spoiled kid testing boundaries he had never encountered before. What Tyler didn't know was that he was provoking someone who had served in elite units, received 3 Combat Valor medals, and led rescue missions that saved dozens of lives. David had faced trained enemy soldiers who showed him more respect than this privileged kid. "Hey, soldier boy," Tyler continued, now walking even closer to the isolation rope. "I'm talking to you. My dad pays your taxes, so technically you work for us. How about you get out of there and go get me a soda?" An elderly veteran in a wheelchair began to approach, his medals gleaming on his chest. "Boy," he said, his voice trembling with anger, "you have no idea who you're talking to." Tyler turned away with disdain. "Oh, another boring old man trying to lecture me. You lost the war anyway, didn't you? What kind of soldiers are you?" That's when something interesting happened. David Washington, still standing at attention, did something almost imperceptible. His eyes moved slightly to the left, where a man in a discreet suit was watching the scene with keen interest. The man nodded almost imperceptibly and began to speak softly into a small device attached to his lapel. Patricia Morrison tried once more to control the situation. "Tyler, that's enough. Let's get out of here." But she spoke without conviction, like someone who had given up on educating her own son long ago. "I don't want to leave," Tyler replied, crossing his arms. "I want to see if this fake soldier can make me leave. I bet he doesn't even have the guts to move out of his statue position." To provoke him further, Tyler began to imitate David's military posture in a grotesquely exaggerated manner, marching comically around the rope while making faces and distorted military marching sounds. Several people began to film, but not out of admiration, out of utter indignation. What no one realized was that David was mentally cataloging every word, every gesture, every second of that public humiliation. His years of military training had taught him something Tyler Morrison would never learn: strategic patience. Sometimes the best response wasn't immediate, but devastatingly calculated. The man in the suit kept talking into his device, and David knew exactly who he was contacting. Because David Washington wasn't just a decorated soldier. He was also a graduate of West Point with a degree in military psychology, an expert in behavior under pressure, and more importantly, the son of one of the most influential families in Washington, D.C. His father, Colonel James Washington, was a military advisor to Congress. His mother, Dr. Angela Washington, was one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the country. And David? David had connections Tyler Morrison could never dream of. "Mom, look at that!" Tyler shouted, now completely out of control. "The little soldier doesn't even move. I bet if I threw something at him, he wouldn't even react. What a pathetic soldier." Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside David that his oppressors couldn't see, a silent force fueled by the very injustice they tried to impose on him. What that privileged family didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing its own sentence of defeat, built not with anger, but with the surgical precision of someone who had learned that true war is not won with explosions, but with relentless strategy. The man in the discreet suit finished his conversation on the device and slowly approached the commotion. Tyler Morrison continued his pathetic display, now pretending to faint dramatically every time he looked at David Washington as if the mere sight of a black soldier was too traumatic for his privileged eyes. "Oh my God!" Tyler screamed theatrically. "This soldier is scaring me, Mommy. He's looking at me in a threatening way. I think he's going to attack me." Patricia Morrison immediately joined in her son's game. "Excuse me," she shouted to any officer who could hear her. "That guard is intimidating my son. This is unacceptable. You'll be hearing from our lawyer." David Washington watched everything with a serenity that only someone who had faced real combat could maintain. Every racist word, every gesture of contempt, every attempt at humiliation was mentally catalogued with the precision of a military strategist. Because David wasn't just a soldier. He was a soldier who had learned that the most important battles aren't won with brute force, but with superior intelligence. The man in the suit finally identified himself, approaching the Morrison family, with a discreet but official badge. "Agent Johnson, Presidential Protection Service," he said calmly. "I need to talk to you about your son's behavior." Richard Morrison finally put away his cell phone, his face turning pale as he realized that the situation had escalated to levels that his money might not be able to resolve. Secret Service? That's ridiculous. My son is just a kid playing around. "Sir, your son is disrupting an official military ceremony and making racist comments against a member of the armed forces," Agent Johnson replied, with the professional coldness of someone who had dealt with much more serious threats. "This constitutes a disturbance of the peace and a possible hate crime." Tyler, who until then had felt invincible, protected by his parents' wealth, began to realize that he might have stirred up something bigger than he imagined. But instead of backing down, his youthful arrogance led him to make the fatal mistake of escalating the situation even further. "Hate crime?" Tyler laughed hysterically. "For talking to a little black cop? You guys are crazy. My dad knows the governor. You can't do anything to me." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't just shock. It was the heavy stillness that precedes earthquakes. David Washington, still in position, allowed an almost imperceptible smile to touch the corner of his mouth. Because Tyler Morrison had just made the mistake David had been waiting for. He had used explicitly racist language in front of a federal agent. What the Morrison family didn't know was that Agent Johnson wasn't there by chance. He had been assigned to that particular memorial because it was a special ceremony, one that honored soldiers who had died fighting domestic supremacists. And David Washington wasn't just any soldier in that honor guard. David was the soldier who had led the rescue mission that saved 12 hostages from a domestic terrorist group in Montana. He was the same David Washington who had been personally decorated by the President of the United States 6 months earlier. He was the son of Colonel James Washington, a military advisor to the Pentagon, and Dr. Angela Washington, who had successfully sued 3 corporations for racial discrimination. More importantly, David Washington had recorded every word of that interaction on a standard military audio device that all honor guards carried during official ceremonies, a security protocol that recorded any disturbance or potential threat. Agent Johnson looked at Tyler with an expression that made the boy swallow hard for the first time in his life. "Young man, you have just publicly confessed to racially motivated disruption of a federal military ceremony. That completely changes the nature of this situation." Patricia Morrison tried one last desperate gambit. "You can't be serious. He's only 11 years old. This is absurd." "Ma'am," Agent Johnson replied, "racial discrimination is a federal crime regardless of age. And your son has not demonstrated childish behavior. He has demonstrated behavior of someone who has been taught that he can humiliate other human beings based on the color of their skin." Meanwhile, David held his ground, but something had changed in his demeanor. It was no longer just passive resistance. It was the calculated stillness of a predator who had identified his prey and was preparing for the final pounce. His years of military training, his education in behavioral psychology, his family connections, And now the recorded evidence were all lining up perfectly. A veteran in a wheelchair approached the group, his medals gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Agent Johnson," he said. "I'm retired Colonel Martinez. I served with Sergeant Washington's father. If you need witnesses to what happened here, I have 15 veterans ready to testify." The net was closing in, but Tyler Morrison still hadn't realized that he had fallen into a trap built by his own arrogance and prejudice. He looked around and saw faces that had been passive spectators now turning into a hostile audience, documenting his every move. David Washington finally allowed himself a thought he had suppressed throughout the humiliation. "You picked the wrong soldier to try to break, kid." What Tyler Morrison didn't know was that his attempt to humiliate a decorated war hero was about to become the most expensive lesson of his privileged life. And unlike the mischief his parents had always been able to cover up with money, this time he had messed with forces that would turn his arrogance into a public lesson that would echo far beyond that memorial. It was when everyone laughed at his latest racist taunts that something extraordinary began to take shape. Not just in the strategic mind of David Washington, but mainly in the determined look that now shone with a silent intensity of someone who was about to demonstrate that true strength does not come from inherited privilege, but from honor earned. On battlefields where real men are tested, the moment of truth arrived when Agent Johnson received a call that would completely change the course of the situation. He answered professionally, but his expression gradually changed from concern to something resembling reverential respect. "Understood, Colonel Washington," he said into the phone, his eyes fixed on David with new understanding. "Yes, sir, your son is fine. We will proceed according to your instructions." Tyler Morrison stopped teasing for a moment, realizing that something had changed drastically in the dynamics of the situation. Patricia and Richard exchanged nervous glances, their business instincts finally detecting that they might have gotten themselves into something much bigger than a simple fight with a soldier. "Morrison family," Agent Johnson said, putting away his phone and assuming an even more official stance. "I just spoke with Colonel James Washington, military advisor to the Pentagon and father of Sergeant Washington. He is on his way accompanied by Dr. Angela Washington, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country." The blood drained from Richard Morrison's face. As a tech CEO, he knew powerful names when he heard them, and those names represented a level of influence that his money couldn't buy or intimidate. David Washington finally broke his guard, turning slowly to face Tyler Morrison directly. When he spoke, his voice carried not only military authority but the refined education of someone who had graduated from one of the most prestigious military academies in the country. "Young Mr. Morrison," David said, his perfect diction contrasting brutally with the hysterical screams Tyler had uttered minutes earlier. "You have just committed a racially motivated federal crime against a decorated military officer. But more important than that, you have made a choice that will define the rest of your life." Tyler tried to keep up his bravado, but for the first time his voice came out shaky. You can't do anything to me. My father has money. We know important people." David smiled for the first time since the provocation had begun. It wasn't a cruel smile, but the patient smile of someone who was about to deliver a devastatingly educational lesson in reality. "Tyler," David said, removing a small recording device from his uniform, "during my years in the military, I learned that people reveal who they really are when they think there are no consequences. Every racist word you've said, every insult, every taunt has been recorded in high definition by this standard military equipment." Patricia Morrison let out a muffled scream. As an experienced socialite, she immediately understood the implications of having racist behavior documented on professional quality audio. "But that's not all," David continued, his voice maintaining the polite professional tone that contrasted sharply with the growing panic of the family. "You see, Tyler, when someone disrupts a federal military ceremony with discriminatory language, it's not just a state crime, it's a federal crime under multiple jurisdictions." Agent Johnson nodded in agreement. disruption of a military ceremony, a hate crime motivated by race, disturbing the peace on federal property, and now with the latest statements, racial intimidation against a public official. Richard Morrison tried one last desperate gambit, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer right now. This is harassment. You're attacking an American family." "Please call," David said calmly. "In the meantime, I would like you to know that in addition to being a decorated soldier, I also have a degree in psychology from West Point Military Academy with a specialization in social behavior and educational interventions for cases of supremacy and toxic privilege." Tyler Morrison's world began to crumble when he realized that he had targeted not just any soldier, but someone who had the academic, military, and family credentials to completely destroy his privileged life. It was at that moment that two imposing figures approached the group. Colonel James Washington, even in civilian clothes, radiated an authority that made even Agent Johnson instinctively stand up straight. At his side, Dr. Angela Washington carried a leather briefcase that seemed to contain the fate of anyone foolish enough to underestimate her family. "David," Colonel Washington said, hugging his son with obvious pride, "I received the situation report. You maintained exemplary composure in the face of systematic racial provocation." Dr. Angela Washington looked at the Morrison family with the clinical gaze of someone who had prosecuted discrimination cases far more subtle and complex than this grotesque display of juvenile racism. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of courtroom experience, "I have just reviewed the recording my son provided. I have bad news for you. This is not going to simply go away." Richard Morrison was now visibly sweating. "Look, we can work this out civilly, maybe a donation to charity, some kind of settlement." "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Washington replied, "you are trying to buy your way out of a federal hate crime. That only adds attempted bribery to the charges." Colonel Washington addressed Tyler directly, who now looked much smaller than his 11 years. "Young man, you chose to attack my son based on the color of his skin. My son who risked his life defending this country, who saved American lives in combat, who graduated with honors from one of the most respected institutions in the world." Tyler finally began to cry, but not tears of genuine remorse, tears of panic as he realized that for the first time in his life, there were real consequences that his parents' money couldn't make go away. I didn't know," Tyler sobbed. "I didn't know he was important." The silence that followed was devastating. David Washington looked at the boy with an expression that mixed pity and educational determination. "Tyler," David said softly, "you just revealed exactly what the problem is. You didn't respect me because you thought I wasn't important. Respect shouldn't depend on a person's status. Every human being deserves basic dignity." Agent Johnson received another call and after listening to it announced, "The national media is on its way. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. The story has been leaked and is now of national interest." Patricia Morrison panicked. "No, our faces can't be on television. This will ruin our social standing. Richard, do something." "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Washington said with a calmness that seemed almost surgical, "your social standing is already ruined. The recording is already being analyzed by federal prosecutors. The question now is whether you will cooperate so that your son can learn something from this experience, or whether you will resist and turn this into a protracted legal battle that you cannot win." Colonel Washington added, "As a father, I understand your concern for your son, but as an American who has served this country, I cannot tolerate racist behavior against my son being minimized or bought off with money." Tyler looked around desperately, searching for someone who could save him, but found only disapproving faces, and for the first time, the reality that actions have consequences that transcend financial privilege. David Washington approached Tyler one last time. "You are 11 years old. That means you can still learn and change. But that change will come through real consequences, not through your parents buying you out of another situation. It was at that moment that the first news van arrived at the memorial, quickly followed by others. The story of the privileged kid who racially attacked a decorated war hero was about to go national, and the Morrison family realized they had made the most expensive mistake of their lives. As cameras positioned themselves and reporters rushed toward him, Tyler Morrison finally understood that he had picked the wrong target at the wrong time, and that his attempt to humiliate an American hero had turned into the most spectacular public humiliation anyone could imagine. But would it be enough to transform a spoiled boy into someone capable of respecting other human beings, or would this public lesson be just the beginning of a much longer and more difficult journey? 6 months later, David Washington stood at the same memorial, but this time as the keynote speaker at the annual Veterans Ceremony. The story of the racist boy who attacked a war hero had become a global landmark on how to confront prejudice with dignity. 6 months ago, David said into the microphone to thousands of people, an 11-year-old boy taught me that the most important battles aren't fought on the battlefield, but against ignorance right here at home. In the audience, far from the spotlight, Tyler Morrison sat next to his counselor. The last 6 months had been the most difficult of his privileged life. His family had lost millions after the story went viral. Richard Morrison was forced to sell the company when investors pulled away from a brand associated with racism. Patricia lost all of her elite social friends. Tyler had gone through an intensive re-education program, working with wounded veterans, and learning about real sacrifice. For the first time, he faced consequences without the protection of his parents' money. I recently received a letter that I would like to share, David continued, acknowledging Tyler in the audience. It's from someone who caused me pain, but who gave me the opportunity to show that education can be more powerful than anger. David read excerpts from the 5-page letter Tyler had written. Sergeant Washington, I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I understand now what I did. It wasn't just disrespecting you, it was disrespecting everyone who has served our country. I've learned that heroes are people like you who protect others even when they don't deserve protection. Tyler felt genuine tears, not of frustration, but of someone who finally understood the magnitude of his actions. This letter has taught me that our greatest victory is not in defeating our enemies, but in turning them into allies, David concluded. After the ceremony, Tyler approached hesitantly. Sergeant Washington, I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me when everyone else said I was a lost cause. David smiled, extending his hand. Tyler, you've proven that no one is a lost cause if they're willing to do the hard work of real change. I'm proud of you. The handshake symbolized something greater than personal forgiveness. It represented growth and transformation. Today, David serves as a national consultant on military diversity programs and has been promoted to major. His story has inspired thousands to enlist and millions to confront prejudice with dignity. Tyler dedicates weekends working at veteran centers and speaks at schools about the dangers of unchecked privilege. His family has learned that real value doesn't come from money, but from respect earned through worthy actions. The most powerful lesson is not about revenge or public humiliation, but about how injustice can be transformed into education that resonates far beyond the original protagonists. David proved that true military strength lies not only in winning battles, but in transforming hearts. The most unlikely heroes emerge not from those who have never made mistakes, but from those who have had the courage to acknowledge mistakes and work to correct them. David's greatest victory was not defeating a prejudiced boy. It was helping to raise a young man who will dedicate his life to fighting the same prejudice that once defined him. If this story of transformation and second chances touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove real change is possible when we face choices with courage and determination to grow.